Welcome back, friends, and get ready to listen as Rupert reads The Adventures of Jerry Muskrat by Thornton W Burgess, Chapters 7 through 9. Chapter 7, Jerry Muskrat Makes a Discovery. The beautiful springtime had brought a great deal of happiness to the Smiling Pool, as it had to the Green Meadows and to the Green Forest. Great-Grandfather Frog, who had slept the long winter away in his own special bed way down in the mud, had waken up with an appetite so great that for a while it seemed as if he could think of nothing but his stomach. Jerry Muskrat had felt the spring fever in his bones and had gone up and down the Laughing Brook, poking into all kinds of places just for the fun of seeing new things. Little Joe Otter had been more full of fun than ever, if that was possible. Mrs. and Mrs. Redwing had come back to the bulrushes from their winter home way down in the warm Southland. Everybody was happy, just as happy as could be. One summer morning, Jerry Muskrat sat on the big rock in the middle of the Smiling Pool, just thinking of how happy everybody was, and laughing at Little Joe Otter, who was cutting all sorts of capers in the water. Suddenly, Jerry's sharp eyes saw something that made him wrinkle his forehead in a puzzled frown, and look at the opposite bank. Finally, he called over to Little Joe. "Hi, Little Joe, come over here," shouted Jerry. "What for?" asked Little Joe, turning a somersault in the water. "I want you to see if there is anything wrong with my eyes," replied Jerry. Little Joe Otter stopped swimming and started at Jerry Muskrat. "They look all right to me," said he as he started to climb up the big rock. "Of course they look all right," replied Jerry, "but what I want to know is if they see all right. Look over at that bank." Little Joe Otter looked over at the bank. He stared and stared, but he didn't see anything unusual. It looked just as it always did. He told Jerry Muskrat so. "Then it must be my eyes," said Jerry. "It certainly must be my eyes. It looks to me as if on the water doesn't come up as high on the bank as it did yesterday." Little Joe Otter looked again, and his eyes wide opened. You are right, Jerry Muskrat," he cried. "There's nothing the matter with your eyes. The water is as low as it ever gets, even in the middle of summer. What can it mean?" "I don't know," replied Jerry Muskrat. "It is queer. It certainly is very queer. Let's go ask Grandfather Frog. You know he is very old and very wise, so perhaps he can tell us what it means." Splash! Jerry Muskrat and Little Joe Otter dived into the Smiling Pool and started a race to see who could reach Grandfather Frog first. He was sitting among the bulrushes on the edge of the Smiling Pool, for the lily pads were not yet big enough for him to sit on comfortably. "Oh, Grandfather Frog, what's the matter with the Smiling Pool?" they shouted as they came up quite out of breath. "Jug-a-rum, there's nothing the matter with the Smiling Pool. It's the best place in all the world," replied Grandfather Frog gruffly. "But there is something the matter," insisted Jerry Muskrat, and then he told what he had discovered. "I don't believe it," said Grandfather Frog. "I never heard of such a thing in springtime." Chapter 8, Grandfather Frog Watches His Toes. Grandfather Frog sat among the bulrushes of the edge of the Smiling Pool. Over his head, Miss Redwing was singing as if her heart would burst with the very joy of springtime. "Tra-la-la-la-lee, see me, happy am I as I can be. Happy as I am the whole day long, as I sing my gladsome song." Of course, Miss Redwing was happy. Why shouldn't he be? There it was, the beautiful springtime, the gladdest time of all the year, the time when happiness creeps into everybody's hearts. Grandfather Frog listened. He nodded his head. "Jug-a-rum, I'm happy too," said Grandfather Frog. But even as he said it, a little worry look crept onto his big, goggly eyes, and then down in the corners of his big mouth, which had been stretched into a smile. Little by little, the smile grew smaller and smaller, until there wasn't any smile. No, sir, there wasn't any smile. Instead of looking happy, as he said he felt, Grandfather Frog actually looked unhappy. The fact is, he couldn't forget what Jerry Muskrat and Little Joe Otter had told him, that there was something the matter with the Smiling Pool. He didn't believe it, not a word of it. At least, he tried to make himself that he didn't believe it. They had said that the water in the Smiling Pool was growing lower and lower, just as it did in the middle of summer, in the very hottest weather. Now, Grandfather Frog is very old and very wise, and he had never heard of such a thing happening in the springtime. So he wouldn't believe it now. And yet Grandfather Frog had an uncomfortable feeling that something was wrong. He knew what it was. He had been sitting in the middle of water, and now he was sitting with only his toes in the water, and he couldn't remember having changed his position. "Of course, I moved without thinking what I was doing," muttered Grandfather Frog, but still the worried look didn't leave his face. You see, he couldn't make himself to believe what he wanted to believe, try as he would. "Jug-a-rum! I know what I'll do. I'll watch my toes!" exclaimed Grandfather Frog. So Grandfather Frog waded out into the water until it covered his feet. Then he sat down and began to watch his toes. Mr. Redwing looked down and saw him, and Grandfather Frog looked so funny, gazing at his own toes, that Mr. Redwing stopped singing long enough to ask, "What are you doing, Grandfather Frog?" "Watching my toes," replied Grandfather Frog gruffly. "Watching your toes? Ho, ho, ho! Watching your toes! Who ever heard of such a silly thing? Are you afraid that they will run away, Grandfather Frog?" shouted Mr. Redwing. Grandfather Frog didn't answer. He kept right on watching his toes. Mr. Redwing flew away to tell everybody he met how Grandfather Frog had become foolish and was watching his toes. The sun shone down warm and bright, and pretty soon Grandfather Frog's big goggly eyes began to blink. Then his head began to nod, and then Grandfather Frog fell fast asleep. By and by, Grandfather Frog awoke with a start. He looked down at his toes. They were not in the water at all. Indeed, the water was a good long way. "Jug-a-rum! There is something wrong with the Smiling Pool!" cried Grandfather Frog, as he made a long jump into the water and started to swim out to the big rock. Chapter 9. The Laughing Brook Stops Laughing. There was something wrong. Grandfather Frog knew it in the very minute he got up the morning. At first he couldn't think what it was. He sat with just his head out of the water, and blinked his great goggly eyes. As he tried to think what it was that was wrong, suddenly Grandfather Frog realized how still it was. It was a very different kind of stillness from anybody he could remember. He missed something, and he couldn't think what it was. It wasn't the song of Mr. Redwing. There were many times when he didn't hear that. It was. Grandfather Frog gave a startled jump out onto the shore. "Jug-a-rum! It's the Laughing Brook! The Laughing Brook has stopped laughing!" cried Grandfather Frog. Could it be? Who ever heard of such a thing? Excepting when Jack Frost found the Laughing Brook with hard black ice. Why, in the springtime and in the summer and in the fall, the Laughing Brook had laughed such a merry, happy laugh ever since Grandfather Frog could remember. And he can remember way back in the long ago. For he is very old and very wise. Never once in all the time had the Laughing Brook failed to laugh. It couldn't be true now. Grandfather Frog put a hand behind one ear and listened, but not a sound could be heard. "Jug-a-rum! It must be me," said Grandfather Frog. "It must be that I am growing old and deaf. I'll go ask Jerry Muskrat." So Grandfather Frog dived into the water and swam out into the middle of the Smiling Pool on his way to Jerry Muskrat's house. It was then that he first realized the truth of what Jerry Muskrat and Little Joe Otter had told him the day before. There was something very, very wrong with the Smiling Pool. He stopped swimming to look around, and it seemed as if the great goggly eyes would pop right out of his head. Yes, sir, it seemed as if those great goggly eyes certainly would pop right out of Grandfather Frog's head. The Smiling Pool had grown so small that there wasn't enough left of it to smile. "Where are you going, Grandfather Frog?" asked a voice over his head. Grandfather Frog looked up. Looking down on him from over the edge of the big rock was Jerry Muskrat. The edge of the big rock was twice as high above the water as Grandfather Frog had ever seen it before. I was going to swim over to your house to see you," replied Grandfather Frog. "It's no use," replied Jerry, "because I'm not there. Besides, you couldn't swim there anyway." "Why not?" demanded Grandfather Frog in great surprise. "Because it isn't in the water any longer. It's way up on dry land," said Jerry Muskrat in the most mournful voice. "What's that you say?" Grandfather Frog, as if he couldn't believe his own ears. It's just as true as that I'm sitting here, replied Jerry sadly. Listen, Jerry Muskrat, and tell me truly, is the Laughing Brook laughing? Cried Grandfather Frog. No, replied Jerry. The Laughing Brook has stopped laughing, and the Smiling Pool has stopped smiling, and I think the world is upside down. And that's the end of this chapter, and if you liked what you heard, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. Thank you.